wilderness characteristics inventory and where that's going to end up at. The county is a cooperating agency. As a cooperating agency, I sat through 3 days of meetings last week as they're doing some, putting some things in different categories. I will let the BLM, whenever we get to them, fully explain where they're at in their process. Just to let you know, during that meeting and at the end of the meeting, as a cooperating agency, I made sure that the maps from the road inventory that was done through community meetings in 2012, those maps were done. They were brought into the official county record and submitted to BLM as the official record. BLM has that knowledge is added into the minutes, I believe, of what they were doing. I have a copy of the maps here to go back down to the BLM. We will retain the originals. I know there's some people here that was very much interested in make sure those maps were part of this. BLM has accepted those, so that's part of the record. With that said, I believe the only other cooperating agency is the State Fish and Wildlife.
At this point in time.
At this point in time, is there still time that MOUs can be developed for other cooperating agencies?
Yeah, we sent out, I believe, about 40 operating agency letters, but we've only heard back from 2.
Okay.
Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
And the MOUs are still being fully formatted and everything?
Yep.
Okay. Commissioner,
Just for the audience, can you give just a quick synopsis of what a cooperating agency does?
Yeah, so a cooperating agency is another government agency or tribe who has particular expertise in a given area. So in the case of Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, their expertise is related to fish and wildlife habitat management. And so they can bring their expertise to the table during the planning process and essentially give input all the way through the planning process. And so the county's expertise, we're assuming, is knowledge of Lake County, knowledge of the socioeconomic activities from business occurring in the county, and probably a whole host of other items that occur in the county.
thank you. And as please be respectful throughout the meeting. Let Todd and others do their presentation. There will be time for questioning. Whenever you do ask a question or anything, please state your name so our record, the county record, we're able to capture your name as we go through this process. As a cooperating agency, we might want to use some of the comments or reflect on those, so please be sure and let us know who's speaking so Melanie can capture that in the minutes. So with that, Todd, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. All right, I'm not quite sure how to do this, which way to face here.
You're doing introduce yourself?
I am, I will, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm Todd Forbes. I'm the district manager for the Lakeview District BLM. I'm kind of acting in that role right now. My normal day job is I'm the field manager for the Lakeview Resource Area side of the house. Can everybody hear me okay? Do I need to use this? Is this better? Okay. All right. Can you cue up the last one on the list?
Sure, I gave you my mouse.
Oh, you did. I'm in charge. That's right. You told me. Sorry about that. So I know this screen is going to be hard to see. Hopefully I can see it from there.
And Todd, do you want to field questions throughout your presentation or get through that and then field questions, just so people know?
Let's play it by ear. As long as, if it's a question you can hold till the end of the presentation, great. If it's something specific about one of the slides, then I'd like to cover those as we're going through, because it's hard to go back If it gets to the point to where we're not going to do the presentation because there's too many comments coming in, then we may need to weigh that. But
Okay.
So I was kind of talking to the commissioners one day and was kind of trying to figure out a way to get more information out of folks. And so we felt maybe this was a way for the commissioners to kind of ask folks to come in for a meeting and then ask us down to answer any questions people might have. And so that's kind of why I'm here today. Kind of my goals for today's discussion is to explain the wilderness character inventory, what it is and what it's not. There's a lot of rumors floating around about what wilderness character means, what finding it means, and I want to make sure that everybody's kind of has the same understanding that we do. We want to explain how that inventory fits into our resource management plan amendment that we're just getting started on right now, and describe how the public can participate in both of those processes. So what is an inventory in general? Part of the reason I threw this in is because I really want to make people understand that what's out there is just an inventory. So an inventory is just a simple way for BLM to determine the presence or absence of something. An inventory it's basically a BLM finding. It's flexible and it can change from day to day. So it's no different than if we go do a stream survey and we count fish in a stream. That's an inventory. If we go count sage grouse on a lek site, that's an inventory. It's no different than assessing timber in a forest. Okay, it's the same kind of inventory, but wilderness character is one of those things that's, you can't see it and you can't count it necessarily. It's intangible, so it's one of those things that's every different observer has a little bit of a different view of, right? So what is an inventory not? An inventory is not a management decision. I really want to stress that. Management decisions occur in land use plan amendments, our resource management plan, the RMP. That's where the management decision is going to occur. And then why are we doing this inventory right now? We're required to do this inventory under a court-ordered settlement agreement on the Lakeview RMP. And we're going to dive more into this as we kind of keep going here. So just a little history of the wilderness inventory process. So the original wilderness inventory was completed in 1979 and 1980 and was published in 1991. So when we created our Lakeview Resource Management Plan, that was signed in 2003. We selected an alternative. It was signed. We went forward with that management plan and managing the landscape in that fashion. In 2005, we were sued in the RMP over a failure to update wilderness character for both the Lakeview and Vail District RMPs. The RMP on the Vail District is called the Southeast Oregon RMP. You're going to hear me reference Vail just because it's a lot easier than saying the Southeast Oregon RMP over and over again. So both of our RMPs, in 2010, that court ruling finally came down vacating the Vail Resource Management Plan. Basically vacated the entire plan. Vail was going to have to go back to the drawing board. And so at that time, both the Lakeview and the Vail districts entered into a settlement agreement with the plaintiffs. So that settlement agreement, essentially there's three things that we had to address in that settlement agreement. One was do an inventory for wilderness characteristics, determine how those areas are going to be managed. Another issue was off-highway vehicle designations. So our areas open to cross-country travel, closed to cross-country travel, or limited to existing or designated roads and trails. And then a third, out of that settlement agreement, third thing was what happens when somebody voluntarily relinquishes a grazing permit, what happens to that permit? We're going to dive into that a little bit more when we get down here. So, court-ordered ruling settlement agreement in 2010. Between 2008 and 2012, we started working on an inventory update. So, we were almost finished with that inventory update, and that update had not found a lot of wilderness characteristics. In 2012, there was a new wilderness characteristics inventory manual published. And in 2014, there was an independent internal BLM review of the findings comparing Vail and the Lakeview findings. They went back, looked at each district independently, looked at what our findings were, how those wilderness characteristics inventories were written, what information was in them, and based on that review, there was a reassessment checklist that came out of that review. I put some copies over there on the table. I'm not sure I had enough for everybody, but I've got copies of all the documents referenced in here. If you didn't get copies and you need copies, come see me after and I'll make sure you get a copy.
Just for the audience, the difference between WSAs and this wilderness.
So, good question. So wilderness study areas is that original inventory in 1979 and 1980. That was done under a separate process of the law. We're not talking about reassessing WSAs. That is sitting before Congress. There's nothing I can do about those WSAs. So the settlement agreement required us to go back and survey all of the other lands outside of wilderness study area. And I'm going to get into the differences on management as we go here. So wilderness study areas sitting before Congress, waiting for Congress to act on it. I don't have a lot of discretion in how those areas are managed. We have a manual that tells us how we're supposed to manage those. With wilderness inventory, I have a lot more latitude and a lot more discretion in how those areas are managed. So that's the major difference. Wilderness study areas, we don't have a lot of discretion. Wilderness characteristics, we have a lot more discretion. So after the reassessment checklist came out in 2015, we were directed to go back, reassess all of our wilderness characteristics units based on that reassessment checklist and based on the new manual. And that was basically 2.7 million acres of land. So it's taken us about 3 years to do that. So I'm gonna jump into the wilderness inventory process here and go through some process slides. One of the things I want to caution folks on, you know, anybody that's spent any time in wilderness has an idea what that looks like, right? We all bring something different to the table. And so what our inventory is based on isn't what we personally feel wilderness is. It's what's in the manual and what the direction is in the manual and the checklist we've been given. And so keep that in mind as we go through this. These areas aren't necessarily my vision of what wilderness is. It's what our manual tells us, what direction we've got. So there's 4 basic things we look at when we're doing a wilderness inventory. The first thing is we've got to figure out what the area is that's going to be inventoried. You've got to figure out where the boundaries are, right? Okay. So what makes up boundaries of a wilderness characteristics inventory area? Roads that meet the definition under the wilderness characteristics guidelines. So what is that? And unfortunately I brought some posters, but we didn't have a lot of wall space to put them up. So the road definition under wilderness characteristics is a road that was mechanically constructed or improved and has been maintained enough over time to maintain regular and continuous use. So I'm not going to dive way deep into what all that means. If you have questions, you can ask me afterwards, or I can point you in the right direction to get those definitions. So once we do figure out where all the roads that meet the wilderness definition are at, then we also look at other things. We look at boundaries of non-federal land. So if they're state or private boundaries, those are not considered in the inventory. If there's a private piece of land in the middle of BLM, that piece of private land is not considered in the inventory. The other things that make up boundaries are rights-of-ways. So if we have a power line going somewhere, the right-of-way boundary of that power line becomes a boundary of an assessment area. Okay, so size. Once we have our boundaries established, the areas have to contain at least 5,000 acres. If they're smaller than 5,000 acres, they can still have wilderness characteristics if they're contiguous to another area that has wilderness characteristics. So in other words, if we were up against the Forest Service and there was a Forest Service wilderness area or a Forest Service roadless area, and BLM had a little piece next to it that didn't meet 5,000 acres, if those two parcels of land were contiguous, in other words, they didn't have a road or another boundary between them, then that parcel on our side of the fence could potentially have wilderness characteristics. So those are only other federal land boundaries. So after something has met the size criteria, then we look at naturalness. Does it appear to be natural to the casual observer? This is a place where we got hung up on our first inventory. What is the casual observer? Great question. There's no definition in the law. The third thing we look at is outstanding opportunities for solitude or outstanding opportunities for primitive and unconfined recreation. So it has to have all three of those things in order to have wilderness characteristics.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My name's Benny there. The ones I saw, I didn't look at them all, but they didn't meet any of the criteria except contiguous. And they're all,
Except size.
yeah, and they're all less than 5,000. So how does that, like I just don't remember.
So I guess I would ask.
If your paperwork says that it doesn't meet any of the criteria, except it does because it's under a certain size and it's contiguous, but then everything else says there's no wilderness characteristics there, but I don't understand just because it's contiguous what makes it wilderness.
So if an area is contiguous, I want to make sure I understand your question. So are you asking that if an area is contiguous and the area that's contiguous doesn't meet the size criteria
Or the other criteria.
and doesn't meet the other criteria?
It's just because it's contiguous is the only reason
Right.
it's under review now.
So the answer to that question is when a unit is contiguous, we're not only considering that portion that's on BLM, we're considering the whole thing. So if there's, in that example I used earlier, if there's a portion on the Forest Service that's already wilderness or roadless, and we have, say, a 500-acre parcel that's contiguous, we don't just look at our 500-acre parcel, we have to look at the whole thing.
So 10 years from now, when we do another inventory, stuff contiguous to that parcel that was just added, is that going to be wilderness?
So what would have to happen for that to change, if that was something was gonna be added later on, is whatever formed the boundary of that 500-acre unit. I'm assuming that 500-acre unit has, let's just say it has roads all the way around it. Those roads would have to no longer meet the definition for wilderness characteristics in order for that to change. There's a lot of debate in what appears natural to the casual observer.
And the solitude, you know, like all Lake County could be solitude.
And there's a lot of debate on what outstanding means. And so There's a little bit of guidance in the manual. There's a lot more guidance we were given in the checklist. And so that's what we based our stuff on, is the direction we were given. So I'm going to kind of go through that reassessment checklist. Again, some of this is going to be a little hard to read, but essentially with our roads, there wasn't really much changes on our side of the fence for that. Those were relatively minor changes. This is trying to kind of paint a picture for everybody of what changed between the original inventory that we did between 2008 and 2012 and what's changed with the more recent inventory. So, like I said earlier, roads have to have been mechanically constructed or improved, and mechanical maintenance have received maintenance to ensure regular and continuous use.
On mechanical or improved just the hand equipment?
So, either construction or improvement, essentially it does not mean heavy equipment, okay? Or maintenance, for that matter. It basically could be a road that was mechanically constructed using hand tools. We've got probably a lot of old military roads, a lot of those kind of things that were mechanically constructed, but they didn't have heavy equipment when they did it. So it does not necessarily mean heavy equipment. One of the things that had a larger change that we were kind of given, so when we did our initial assessment, we looked at a geographic area. It might be, say, 10,000 acres in size, had some very highly apparent unnatural features in it, and we said the entire area is unnatural because there are some unnatural features. So one of the things that was changed during that process by the checklist is we didn't follow the manual closely enough, and so they told us we needed to go back. Any of those areas, those unnatural features that were close to the border, needed to be trimmed out. And if the area that was left was at least 5,000 acres in size, then we had to do an assessment on what was left.
Todd,
Yeah.
on the mechanical maintenance, is this driving over it once a year, mechanical maintenance?
So that is not mechanical maintenance. But the portion where you get to ensuring regular and continuous use, so the one thing it does say is simple passage of a vehicle doesn't count as maintenance, it doesn't count as construction or any of that. But passage of a vehicle under regular and continuous use depends on the reason the route was established. If the route was established to go to a spring development, and you go there once every other year when your livestock are in there to check on that spring development, then we're considering that regular and continuous use. Okay. There's no chair up here if anybody wants to do it. So, reassessing prior conclusions on on-the-ground conditions. So, one of the things they identified and told us we needed to fix was during the 1980 inventory, some units might have had a conclusion that said this unit is relatively flat, there's no screening, there's no opportunities for solitude. And it's not that something physically changed on the ground, it's that when we go out and reassess those, if we find that the unit wasn't flat, that it had a lot of topography, it may have a canyon running through the middle of it or something else, we had to consider those conditions when we did the re-inventory. Solitude. So areas lacking vegetative and topographic screening may still have outstanding opportunities for solitude. So this is something that was in the original manual. I think the example they use are these, big, large dry lake beds. You go out on Bonneville Salt Flats, even though it's flat as a pancake, there's not a scrap of vegetation. If a unit is big enough, it can still have solitude. How big is that big? There's no definition of size. Okay, again on solitude, one of the things we compared in the last inventory we did that changed, we considered the sights and sounds from outside the inventory area. If we had an inventory area and right next to it we had an area where people routinely go to ride their four-wheelers, ride OHVs, we kind of took that into account. And we were told during this process, during the checklist process, that we were not allowed to consider those things that were outside the unit. The only thing that you consider when something is outside the unit is something so large and pervasive that you can't get away from it in the unit. I don't know what a good example of that would be, but
So I may have an example of that.
go ahead.
The MOA, the fly space from Kingsley Field, we were talking about sound and solitude. And I pulled down the maps, and it takes in almost the whole area. So with my view, is that part of solitude is now gone.
I brought up that argument when they were working on the checklist. And I was told that it had to be something that was there the majority of the time. It was infrequent flights. They didn't count, we got shot down in there. Yeah, we brought that argument up ourselves.
Todd,
Yeah,
another example of that is that it doesn't sound like it's gonna make much difference, because it seems like there's a subjective way around whatever it is. But, we had one of the first wilderness study areas on top of Eagle Rim, and it's, excuse me, still active. You can be up there any time of the day, and we have been for years. You can hear every car that goes along on the highway in there, 24 hours a day. You know what the guy told me? Just turn around and look the other way. I mean, that's what you're dealing with there.
like I said, it's the manual and the process we're given. So primitive and unconfined recreation. One of the things that we did wrong in our original inventory is in some of the units, we looked at what existing use was. You know, we said, yeah, maybe there are opportunities for some primitive and unconfined recreation, but we're not receiving that use right now. We're not allowed to consider what the current use is. We have to consider what opportunities are present should somebody want to use it for that use. So if you think of forms of primitive and unconfined recreation, hiking, backpacking, all those kind of things, you can almost do that kind of activity anywhere. Okay. The last thing that we did, which this wasn't kind of a big issue for us, I don't think, we aren't allowed to compare one unit to another. So when you think of, especially the last two issues, outstanding opportunities for solitude and outstanding opportunities for unconfined and primitive recreation, just the term outstanding means you're comparing it to something, right? So we can't compare it to other units. We can't look at a specific unit. The example I hear everybody use is you've got a unit you're looking at, you can't compare that to the Grand Canyon and say, well, this one isn't any good because it's not as spectacular as the Grand Canyon. Okay, that's an extreme example, but the one thing we can compare to is if we look at all of our wilderness study areas for our entire field office, we combine all of the different kind of things that are in all of those in general, then we can kind of compare that to these units. One of the issues with that is when we look at all of our existing wilderness study areas, they're all over the map. There's a little bit of everything in there, so it makes for a difficult comparison. Okay, so that's the re-inventory checklist. So I just wanted to show kind of some examples of kind of what we go through and look at here, the kind of things we're looking for, so everybody kind of has something in mind. So boundary determination. When we're doing boundary determination, we're looking for evidence of construction. So evidence of construction, the picture on the left, you can obviously see a cut bank where they've leveled the road. That's very plainly obvious, a constructed road. Looks like it's receiving regular and continuous use, no question. The route on the right, what I see in that photograph is I see a rock berm, evidence that when they built that road, they came in with heavy equipment, pushed all the rocks out of the way. The rocks have remained in a line next to the road, so it's pretty easy to see a rock alignment. Both of these meet the wilderness definition of a road. A lot of folks want to go to how rough the road is. That really doesn't matter. Is there evidence of construction? Roads can be incredibly rough and still have been constructed and maintained for regular continuous use. Okay, it's a little hard to see on this small screen, but like we said earlier, roads must have been mechanically constructed, maintained, and ensure regular continuous use. So somebody asked about passage of vehicles. So the route on the left, if you just look, you can just barely make out a two-track that goes up on top of that butte. That's a route that's been constructed purely just by people driving there. Okay, there's no evidence of construction. Those do not meet the wilderness definition of a road, so they cannot be a boundary.
Even if, call that a user created, even if the BLM actually uses some of those routes themselves when you're doing your work.
We use them ourselves, the public uses them, yes. They just don't meet a wilderness boundary definition. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to make a decision to close those routes. If you think about WSAs, all those roads that are internal to a WSA are the same thing. They didn't meet the wilderness definition to become a boundary, but the vast majority of those are still open to public use. They've not been closed. And so that's kind of the same thing, those internal, in the WSA lingo, they call those ways. All those ways that are internal in the center of the WSA are the same as the route on the left. You can still drive them. They just weren't mechanically constructed.
Todd?
Yeah.
How many of these roads around have been closed or erased around the county thus far?
So actively by BLM, you mean, or just over the passage of time they've?
Actively by BLM in the last years, let's say.
Since the 2003 RMP, so I got here in 2000, so I've been here almost 19 years. In the 2003 RMP, I don't remember what the final selection was.
It was in the mid-200 to 250 miles. The original was 500 miles, but it's reduced down to 250 through that process.
So
Miles of road.
those were
Routes,
routes that were closed during the original RMP.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of those were either routes that had already been overgrown, like the photo on the right,
Mm-hmm.
or routes where you had two routes going to the same place that weren't very far apart, so they were redundant, so we didn't need both of them. There were a few places where there were routes that were closed, shorter segments that were closed, either in WSA or in some of the ACECs or RNAs. And 250 sounds like a big number, right? 250 miles. When we look at the routes in our field office, we have about 7,000 miles of routes, motorized routes in our field office. So during the 2003 RMP, we closed about 250 miles out of about 7,000. And how many of those were actually physically erased off the landscape? That's a great question. I don't have a good answer, but I can tell you it's almost none of them. We didn't go in and do active restoration on very, very few of those, if any. Most of that was, a lot of those routes were routes that probably already weren't receiving heavy use, or there was an alternate route, and so they were mainly just closed with a sign. Some of those routes, we still allow administrative use or permitted use, so some of the livestock permittees can still use some of those routes under their permit. and that's part of the reason they weren't obliterated. So we were really looking at passive restoration. So the route on the right, we're kind of looking straight down the route. That's a route that still exists in our 7,000 miles of road inventory. However, a lot of those haven't been driven in so long that there probably hasn't been somebody on that route in 10 years. There's no broken sagebrush. You'd never know it driving by, and if I had to feature a guess, I would say this is a route that probably has a newer, nicer route constructed to wherever people want to go, so they're not using the old one. Realistically, if there isn't an alternative route during hunting season, people are going to use them. So we'll see, you know, even if it's that little 2-week portion of the year, we'll see busted sagebrush, we'll see signs that people have been driving on.
Todd, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is pretty old information. This probably dates back to about 15 years ago. But I was told by a permittee on the Burns District that they encountered some road issues, and I don't know the validity of this, and I just want to know if you've heard of this, that basically a road was somewhere where you could take a 10-wheel truck. Is that,
never heard
okay,
of
I
it.
don't know, that might have been just kind of a hearsay type thing. I
Yeah,
just wanted to
yeah,
know if that was in any, I've never seen it anywhere, but I didn't know it. Okay,
That's never been used in any of the definitions that I've been around.
okay.
I would shoot that down so fast it'd make your head spin. So how much maintenance does a road need to have in order to stay a road? A couple of examples. These aren't probably the best examples. Essentially, we look at the purpose that the route was established for in order to figure out what regular and continuous use is. A road is not, one other definition, you know, you brought up, Jesse, the 10-wheeled truck definition. One other definition that I have heard is, can I drive my Subaru on it? That's not a definition either. We look
I
at
like that answer.
we look at the purpose the route was established for. If the route was established that drives along a fence in order to do fence maintenance, we're going to assume that the person doing that fence maintenance is probably driving a high clearance pickup. And that's the level of maintenance that route requires to receive regular and continuous use. Okay? So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all description. Here's one thing that's caused us a little bit of problem. So just left of the UTV, you see an old route. And to the right, you see where everybody's driving. So this is something that we kind of got aimed for in the checklist, is the route on the left that nobody's using is the route that was constructed. Because that's eroded over time and the rocks have come to the surface, the route on the right is now smoother. It's smoother to drive where there wasn't construction than where there was construction. So the Burns District has had this issue, I think, go to either court or the IBLA, Interior Board of Land Appeals, once or twice, and they've lost on this issue. And so this is something that came up in the checklist. Because that wilderness character inventory stuff is a snapshot in time, we kind of had to consider this. So this, I kind of want to make sure people understand how this affected us. This didn't add a whole bunch of new units that we would have had to do inventory on. This just made some of our units bigger. So there's a couple places where this probably added units, but not a lot. Again, some examples of naturalness issues. You know, we've got a well and...
Just a second, but
Sure.
that kind of brings a question to mind. So if somebody's driving off the road because it's easier on their vehicle, that changes the dynamics, and that no longer qualifies as a boundary type road. But if you can still from 2 miles away see the berm and the mineral soil and the other stuff, it's still not natural.
Right.
So assuming those are still present, it detracts from the naturalness of the site.
I don't disagree. The issue we get into is back into that naturalness category, and I said that naturalness category, what is the casual observer? That's something we kind of got taken to task on. And so what they asked us to do is you look at the unit as a whole and you decide how far away can you see that, and is it something the casual observer would be able to pick out? A lot of those berms and those kind of things, they told us the casual observer isn't going to pick those out. Things like fences, we kind of figured you could see those from about 1/4 of a mile away. So then you look at how much of that unit has those unnatural features. There's no automatic that says this unit has an unnatural feature in the middle of it, and therefore it doesn't meet wilderness characteristics. Believe me, that would make our job way easier. So we've got to sit back and make a judgment call and say how much stuff is in there, how much can you see it, and then make a judgment call on it.
Well, I think that's what I think a lot of this is gonna come down to, because I don't feel those calls were made appropriately
Yeah.
on my range. I expect some of these other guys feel the same way, and that's probably one of the big things that's gonna go on to
I agree.
get.
I guess on this topic, I'm just wondering how, like you said, when it gets all rutted out and everything, they drive to the side, that wouldn't be considered like maintenance of the existing road? Just because I don't think they're gonna go in with equipment and fix that same one, it's a cheaper alternative.
So in instances like this where we went in with equipment and we created a new route next to the other one, those are considered roads.
Okay.
It's only the ones where we haven't gone in and created a new route, where that new route is only by the passage of vehicles. And we've had a little bit of leeway on this, so how many of them are there, how long are they? The ones that we looked at where we considered them to no longer meet that definition was where they were relatively long. So, or in some cases, we found a couple where when the original route was constructed, they went through a passage between a couple of rocks that you can't get your vehicle through, or that's eroded or something like that, where it's impassable. So another example would be you've got a drainage with a culvert. That drainage has been washed out where there's no way to get across it. So it might be short, but it's created an impassable section. These that were passable, we kind of had a little bit of leeway as to how long they were and how frequent they were. Do you have another question?
Yeah, if we don't have a definition of who the casual observer is, who gets to determine what the casual observer sees and doesn't see?
Great question. It's based on the guidelines that we're kind of given as to what the casual observer is. It comes back to a judgment call.
And at the same time, so if the Forest Service or BLM or Fish and Wildlife decides to not maintain their road, they can basically force everyone to drive outside the boundary, and then all of those areas are subject to this situation?
Potentially. Yeah, potentially.
Now, what decides, so say part of the road is no longer maintained, but the rest of the route is still maintained, was that claimed as a road, or did that just, like, what was the definition on determining if it was a road if only part of it was not maintained?
So it depended, so this gets really squishy, because there's no other way to do it. So let's look at a couple examples. So let's say you've got an area that's in a valley bottom that has some low spots that collect water. And people have decided to drive around those low spots. And they're 20 feet long. There's 3 of them. So you've got a 10-mile road. There's 3 places people are driving around that are each 20 feet long. Where does it fall? Anybody want to guess? Okay. We tried to look at also the reason people were driving around. Are they driving around because they want to or because they have to? That person that's out there driving the Subaru, probably where they shouldn't, probably isn't going to go through that mud hole. They're probably driving around the edge. So again, it gets really squishy. It's a great question. In that case, if there were 3 of them, they were each 20 feet long, it was more or less somebody's choice when they're driving because they weren't sure what was in the mud hole. If we felt that the road was passable, you know, going through the mud hole, maybe the mud hole's only there for 2 months a year. If that road was passable, we still called it a road. If it was 3 sections, the same example, 3 sections, 20 feet long on a 10-mile road, and those 3 sections were rutted so bad that I wouldn't allow somebody to drive one of my BLM rigs through there for fear that it was going to do damage, those aren't roads. Those are places where we should have been doing maintenance all along. So it's a great question of maintenance. That question comes up in a lot of these routes. There's a lot of routes in the desert that if you go in and you touch them with heavy equipment, it takes a long time for those routes to get back into a condition where you can drive them. You can do way more damage than you can good. And that's probably part of the reason we've been in this situation. Not because we didn't want to do maintenance, but we were concerned that if we did maintenance, it was going to come out in worse condition than if we'd just left it alone.
But now the lack of maintenance has turned into weaponization against.
So now we're reassessing what we need to do with some of those.
Like a lot of your roads need to be water barred somewhat. That's what happens with your roads are washed away. That's why they're going off the road. Instead of going in their water bar, which should not disturb them that much, it'll happen. I've tried to do it, and I get shut down, you know, when I'm passing through it, because I can't just trigger the ground.
Yeah. Okay. So these are, I guess, some things around the boundaries of the unit that we would look at trimming out. Again, that was something we didn't do in our original process, and we were told we had to go back and do. So if we had a pipeline that paralleled the road, maybe a water tank, those things that were close to those unit boundaries, we were told we had to trim those out of the unit. If the remainder of the unit was still 5,000 acres in size, then we move forward and assess that unit.
Is there a buffer, like off of that water tower, like 100 feet out or 10 feet out? Or?
It was basically, we kind of looked at what the area of disturbance was. So for example, the photo on the left, I mean, it's a little bit of a subjective call, but the area on the left, you know, if you've got an area that's heavily disturbed, when you put in a buried pipeline adjacent to the road, there's usually a line of rocks or a berm of dirt or something. So we were kind of going outside those disturbed areas. Okay, again, back to solitude. So units must provide an outstanding opportunity for solitude somewhere within the unit. This is something else we kind of got taken to task on. So we kind of looked at the majority of the unit, and you know, some units are big and flat. And we said, you know, 80–90% of this unit, you could see somebody standing out there in an orange vest from anywhere within the unit.
What about these huge power lines that go through some of these units?
So
That could be previous.
Yeah, so the power lines will all have right-of-ways associated with them. And so the boundaries of the units will be the edge of the right-of-way outside the power lines. So are you asking about, you've got one of the big 500 kV power lines on the edge of a unit that can kind of be seen from anywhere?
Going through the middle of the unit here.
Yeah, if there's one going through the middle of the unit, then we need to talk about it. So one thing when you look at the maps, sorry, Darwin. So some of the maps show this, and it looks like it's all one big unit. But the reality is these black lines, I tried to darken them up on this map so folks could see them a little better. All of these are breaks in the units, so these are two separate units. This is a road, and so there's a break on those units on the edges of those routes. In this case, this is that 500 kV power line. So if you found a power line inside of a unit, that's something we need to fix. Okay, so the one thing that we were kind of told, you know, solitude, an outstanding opportunity for solitude does not have to exist everywhere within the unit. It can be one place within the unit. An example we were given is you've got a large unit that you can it's more or less flat, there's not a lot of vegetative screening. You can see somebody from pretty much anywhere in the unit, but there's one canyon that runs through the middle of the unit. Somebody could go in there and find solitude. So the bar kind of got lowered a little bit there.
Example of that we discussed last week, of course, what was it, Collins, William?
Yeah, the Coleman.
Anyway, 142 Adele. You get up on the south bank there, you got lots of solitude, but you look at the boundary, actually it comes down to the highway.
Right.
And on that slope, there's no solitude.
Correct.
So we went around and around, and I'm not sure where we, but the whole unit can still be considered, wouldn't it, with that?
The entire,
someplace else.
Right, the entire unit, if there's one place you can find solitude in that unit, the entire unit has solitude. It's not just the portion of the unit that has solitude.
Yeah, Jason Yeager. I'm just curious, so if it has regular and continuous regular and continuous use on a road, then it's not being designated? So what I'm getting at is dirt tanks, springs, those roads to those are...
So you're like one whole step ahead of me.
Okay.
So you're talking about what's going to happen for management on those.
No,
right?
I'm asking if those roads were taken into account.
So they were taken into account, but they were only taken into account depending on what was there. Were they constructed?
Right.
Or were they not constructed? So are you asking the question if a road goes in and it dead ends at a dirt tank?
Yeah.
Okay. Great question. So roads that went in and went to, if a road was constructed, but it doesn't go all the way through the unit, in other words, it's not going to form a boundary to make a unit smaller, those routes that had obvious construction were cherry stemmed. So what is a cherry stem? A cherry stem, it's a very technical term. Cherry stem is a route that, here's your wilderness unit we're assessing, and there's a road that goes in and dead ends. So a cherry stem, this route was constructed. The boundary now comes around, goes around that road and back out and forms a cherry stem. I'm not going to guarantee that every single road that was constructed that's a cherry stem was actually cherry stemmed out, just from the standpoint that we were given a certain time frame to get this done. And all those routes that dead end, you think about how many routes out of that 7,000 miles that dead end, there's a lot. So there possibly could be some of those out there that did not get cherry stemmed, that are constructed routes.
So that particular unit would still qualify?
Yes.
For this characteristic?
If it had everything else, if it was 5,000 acres in size, if it had naturalness, opportunities for solitude, it would still qualify.
I kind of thought an explanation of things, though, that constructed road is what would deny that 5,000 acre boundary. Are you saying there's an exception of cherry stemming?
No, if this dropped below 5,000 acres because of this,
okay,
then it would no longer qualify.
Okay.
Only if it still met the size criteria.
But the buffer around that particular road is minuscule, correct? I mean, okay.
Size-wise, guys, I know folks, one of the things I've heard is folks are saying, well, what if we did this, then it wouldn't meet the size criteria. I can tell you, our units are probably, if we cherry stemmed every road we had, I don't think it'd change any units, size criteria on any single unit. Those units are so big and the cherry stems are so small, I don't think it's gonna make a difference. Our average unit size is probably 17,000 acres.
I have a question on that. It's not, it's kinda about that, but it just kinda brought my mind to something else, and you may address it later on, so if you are, I'll just withdraw the question. But on some of these lands, there's actually been previous plans in place, and what I'm talking about here, for an example, is the Warner Wetlands Plan, that there's supposed to be all-weather roads in the future when it was put together in the late 80s, early 90s. Campgrounds, porta potty type toilets, stuff all through it that was never completed
Never built.
due to funding or anything.
Right.
Do those previous plans, was that taken into effect, that since those are established planning procedures that went through a public process, and should, whether they ever get completed, they, in theory, should be completed, was that taken into consideration in setting up these wilderness? Because, I mean, on the map, I see, the whole north end of the Warner Wetlands was, and
Yeah.
there's quite a few projects that were proposed that were never done. And I just-
Great question, great question. So this process is a snapshot in time. We're not allowed to consider, at this point in time, doing the inventory, we're not allowed to consider any future stuff. Current snapshot in time, what's going on right here, right now. So no, we weren't allowed to consider what was in a previous plan during the inventory process. When we get over to figuring out how these will be managed, then we can consider some of those future plans. And we'll cover some of that here in a little bit when we start talking about the RMP amendment.
So Todd, I have a question on your, I guess it's your second bullet, same on both places. No definition outstanding, we can't compare to other specific wilderness and WSAs. I believe through your process, and everything, a lot of influence was that it's contiguous to a WSA, or there's ACEC, or there's RMA, but that right there says that they can't be considered.
For solitude.
For solitude.
So from a solitude standpoint, we're not allowed to say this unit is better than this unit. If you have a contiguous unit, we look at that unit as a whole and look at whether solitude was in their unit as a whole. So what this is talking about is saying, comparing unit A and unit B, not a contiguous unit, the original unit where the little piece is contiguous now.
I struggle with that, because if there's a wilderness study area over here and there's solitude there, and it's contiguous to this inventory here, it automatically, by that definition, says one point in there you get solitude.
Yes.
And now it encompasses the whole thing. I struggle with that very much.
That's the way the policy is written.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Do you value or rate a percentage-wise on each of these groups? Like if there's 20% solitude, but there's 80% size, how does that work?
So that's something else we've tried to do, is we tried to establish some kind of a numerical scoring or rating. And that's something we got shot down in court the first time, that you can't. It says right in there, you cannot establish some kind of a scoring process during the inventory. That's one of the things that makes it so unbelievably difficult and so subjective, is it really is, a lot of this really comes down to who's doing the inventory and what's there. I mean, the example you used is a great example, that from a solitude standpoint, if you have a unit that's contiguous with another WSA, yeah, it is pretty much automatic. Because solitude already exists in that WSA.
So Todd, how do you define the unit size?
How
do you define each unit size?
So the size is determined by figuring out where the boundaries are. So what forms the boundaries? Roads that meet the wilderness definition of a road right-of-ways for power lines, pipelines, those kind of things, and non-federal ownership. So you go out, you look at a particular geographic area, sorry, I get you again here. So let's take this unit for example. So this black line is the unit boundary. On these three sides, there are roads that meet the wilderness definition of a road, and on this side, it's the BPA power line right-of-way. So that is how that unit size is determined, is you go out of the unit until you hit a road, or you go out of the unit until you hit a non-federal boundary, or you go out until you hit a right-of-way. And that determines the analysis area and the size.
Thank you.
And then primitive and unconfined recreation, we talked a little bit about this. So, again, we can't use existing use. We have to use what the opportunities are.
So like you can't hike, that wouldn't be considered, correct? Because that's an existing use. Or you could do that anyway?
No, what it would be is if we say we have, in the unit we just used as an example, we don't have any hiking or primitive use going on there right now, so therefore it doesn't have primitive and unconfined recreation. They would say it's not what's going on there right now, it's what the opportunity is. Is there an opportunity for somebody to hike or an opportunity for somebody to backpack? Is that opportunity there? And that's what we would measure.
So these guys, say they put on brandings or cattle gatherings as a recreational use, would it qualify them to start a new business and then disqualify on this thought of, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So say these guys, they want to take out 10 people on a guest ride of their ranch and show them how to gather cattle and raise cattle. Not only does it hit the primitive end of it, it also hits a new use.
Right. I don't, there's a couple reasons I don't think that would qualify for what you're thinking. One is, if it is a primitive use, then it pushes it towards primitive use and unconfined recreation. The other thing to remember is this question of solitude or primitive and unconfined use is an or question. It either has to have one or the other. It doesn't have to have both. And most of the units for Lakeview, there are very few that only have recreation. Most have solitude. So even if recreation changed, there's probably only, I'm guessing, maybe 3 or 4 units that only have recreation. So that would be one of the only 3 or 4 units. If for some reason primitive recreation was gone, it wouldn't still have wilderness character because of solitude. Does that help?
I don't think I agree with it, but
yeah.
Because they're really what they're asking you to do on that is to create new business out there, correct? Or new uses.
I don't know that they're asking us to create new uses. I think they're asking us to evaluate what that area could potentially be used for. And this is just as squishy as solitude.
I'm sure it is.
The 2 folks that were doing the review, when I was out with them for doing the review, one of the guys brought up, yeah, maybe there's a great opportunity out here for somebody to go take photographs of sage grouse. And I had to question him. I said, well, how is taking photographs a primitive use? You're using a camera. That, to me, is not a primitive use. So we kind of went round and round on that. I think I won that argument, but.
What about mining?
Mining is probably not well, it depends on the type of mining. You know?
Yeah.
Is it recreation? Are you out recreationally rock hounding, gold pan?
Commercial.
If you're commercial mining, that's probably not a recreational use. So that's gonna not be within a boundary, that's gonna be carved out. If it's substantially noticeable, it's gonna be carved out.
It's not.
No, don't confuse anything we're talking about now with what you can and cannot do on the landscape. Like I said earlier, this is an inventory. This doesn't mean anything about what you can and can't do. So we're gonna get into that, so hopefully I'll answer your question here in a couple minutes. This is just an inventory, either it exists or it doesn't. All right, so again, we started with 805 potential units, just to kind of give you a bit of a picture.
Is the green,
The dark
wilderness
green
study
is
area?
dark green is wilderness study area. The pink are units that are BLM with private trimmed out. Private's probably gray. It's probably hard to see the little pieces of private. Okay, so we started with 805 potential units, and we whittled that down to 118. So the green is still wilderness study area. The areas that are highlighted in blue are areas that are contiguous to WSA. In other words, there was a road between them, and now for some reason that road either doesn't exist, or in some cases there were no roads between the original units. And then the pink are areas with wilderness characteristics. So there was 118 individual polygons, and out of those, when we get into the RMP, there's going to be 100 analysis units. So some of those polygons are contiguous and they're relatively small, but there might be 5 or 6 of them next to each other, and so we're going to look at those as all one analysis unit when we go through the RMP. Okay, so how can the public participate in the BLM Wilderness Character Inventory process? So we're still talking about the inventory. So inventories are always ongoing, they're somewhat flexible, and they can change over time. So one way that folks can participate is if there were mistakes that were made, if you look at the Wilderness Characteristics Inventory units, and they're all posted on the web. This map is also posted on the website, so you can kind of get an idea by the name of the units, where they're located, and then you can go in and open the individual unit document. There's a sheet of paper over there with the website address on it. It's a very long and cumbersome website address to type in. If you want to access that, come and get my card, send me an email, and I'll send you a link, so you don't have to type that big ungodly web address in. Okay, so if we made mistakes, they can still be fixed. The kind of mistakes that we're going to be looking for is if there's stuff on the ground that we missed. So read the wilderness characteristics for a particular unit, read it, see what's in there. If there's something we didn't address in there that we missed, let us know. We can still fix that. If you read the wilderness characteristics unit write-up and you just don't agree with it, there's probably not a lot I can do. If we miss something, there's a mistake, I can fix those. If you just disagree, I don't know how much I can do about that. So just...
Can that be changed both ways? If somebody wanted it bigger, they could come in and...
Yes, absolutely. What we typically rely on, you know, we are responsible for doing periodic inventories, right? But a lot of times what will happen is anybody from the public can submit a citizen's inventory. You can go out, you can look at an area, you can decide for yourself it either has wilderness characteristics or it doesn't have wilderness characteristics, either way. And you can submit an inventory to us. If you want to do that, there are standards for what the minimum standards are for a citizen's submitted inventory. You can't just write me a note and say, I don't think this area has wilderness characteristics. That's not going to meet the minimum standards. There's not much I can do with that. But if you want to submit an inventory in the 6310 manual, and I had a limited set of copies over there, there's probably 2 or 3 paragraphs to talk about what a citizen's inventory should look like. So citizens' inventories can be submitted at any time. Again, because of where we're at in our inventory process, look for those things that we might have missed or didn't address.
Can we get shapefile of those areas?
Yes.
How do we go about getting those?
Send me an email, send Jamie an email. We can point you in the right direction. In fact, I might send us an email. We might be able, I'm not sure if that's something we can put on our website.
I think it's
with the rest of the inventories.
I think there's an inventory for the whole Oregon state.
Actually, you're right. So there is a corporate layer for this with all the information in it that sits on our Portland server, the Portland office. It's for the entire state, but all of our inventories have been updated in that layer. Okay. So, but send me an email and I'll point you in the right direction. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears, and thank you guys for being patient, sitting through this. Brad, you let me know if folks need a break.
I would recommend a break if this is a good place.
This would be a great place, because now we're going to shift gears from what the wilderness inventory is to the RMP amendment and what that's going to mean. So 2 totally different things.
We'll call it a 5-minute break with a term to 10 or better. So, restroom here, restroom out in the main lobby and downstairs also. So let's take a break, come back. We'll just call it 2:25.
Think we can get out of here without bumping this camera? I don't know. Hey, Michael. How you doing? Bye. Not enough. Christmas bag. We got 200 bears still around. Father, they run all that remotes around. We've seen her during the day. So we had a designated role. This is part of my territory. Well, actually, no, the wilderness is like, why would they close down Shelter Lake area? Well, we're going to let them use it. Has some more work done. We had a juniper prairie a couple years ago. We had a big juniper. I'm pretty sure I know where it is. That's likely to be disturbed. That's probably going to happen this fall. They're drying up, but one of the problems we got is people pile up, huge piles. Dave Holgate is doing a project on the adjacent upstairs, just southwest. They can make it a wilderness back again. So we're going to have to pull the pile apart. Holgate's right. Maybe that'll stir up. Exactly.
I mean, that's the thing, is these guys are on the opening day, they had guys. On this counter seal, they've got lawyers everywhere. They keep us tied up litigation. Yeah, I got the picture of it. Sell all the counters, still wouldn't deal with that one lawyer. Yeah,
You know, this one. It's
We're always doing it.
Well, I've given them a number, but the guys at the office, the guys on top, it's getting really
not ours.
They have to schedule it way out.
I thought
What do you think, we're next to you guys. Where do you think I run this? They've left it so open-ended on the other end and closed on our end. I felt it. We didn't get a complimentary Vaseline when we came in. Yeah. I got thinking you started yeah, I can walk out my back door, across the shop, and walk along the hill. Because right after that, there's no parking. And there's 3 people drive by my house a day, so, you know, the noise isn't going to be with you. It sounds like it does. And it's in every unit I have, except for my F and R. Yep. My other, it's that one right there. Yeah, that I went to another pretty much the boundary. I had a business coming in. I asked so he's got to yeah, because they are saying they're going to do a 25-year cut, cut like 2 trees and then off for 5 years. They're not going to do it the first year. Then they're going to do something else. Oh, they're going to spray it for weeds. Then they'll put the seed down. That's 3rd year. Then they're going to make the rest at least a year and a half. That was that one. And I don't know. I think it was fire. came down, you and I for sure 40 down, she dropped in us. You know, and the kid had a wheelchair that walked through there to go to Paisley. And it's just, I don't know why. That's
really good job.
yeah.
Really good job.
Highest level.
See that on one side. Get the feel of this is for stress. You know, here's it.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. We get these wet streets like we all. It's just shoots
That guy's down there, they've been picking up this crap.
They do. These cows crazy, cheap, yeah, it's too bad. I heard though, if you have a drug test, you can take that and kill the weed.
Along the crooked
Yeah.
farm, we didn't know what it was. But man, that's terrible.
Yeah.
We got the workers going, they were somebody trimmed up.
They've already got the good stuff on that one.
Damn there.
Huh. All our country. How much of it is in our retinal? I can see our whole retinal. But is the
Was that solitude?
Is that all right? That's kind of what we
I usually doodle.
He needs to give me your nose. And now we
All right, everybody, we'll try to keep this going faster than we can.
So writing more.
I live out of bed, but I'm just working for a fishing and trying to figure out how to keep access going. A lot of we're about finding the access, but then doing some restoration. Once it becomes, it's getting to see, it's getting, you might not be able to do anything to it. Yeah. Started the whole, can you believe it happened in 2005? They're still going. I'm like, And the whole, I think Tom put the word right, he just calls it squishy. Yeah, squishy is the word of the day.
Yeah, so give me comments.
Okay, we're going to come back into session at 2:26. Everybody, just for clarification, talking with Melanie during the break, you're looking at, put some of this on the county website, so it'll be accessible through the county website.
So Melanie asked that question, and I said if you guys would like to post that, we can make the documents available.
Take notice, social, public,
The other thing, I'm not an IT guy. There might be a way to just put a link on the county website that redirects you over to the site where they're located.
So you got a thumbs up, work with our IT coordinator, which is Melanie, make it happen, if you can. Thank you, guys. So with that, go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, so now we're gonna launch into a whole new thing here. So we've talked about the inventory process and what the inventory is, how we got there, what it means. So realistically, now you ask the so what question. We found wilderness characteristics, so what? So, as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, just because we have wilderness characteristics, that is an inventory. It determines presence and absence. It does not determine whether an area is going to be managed in a certain way. So when you figure out management, that is the land use planning process, and that is an RMP amendment. Okay? So when we started, I talked about the fact that we were doing this now was because of a settlement agreement, right? Court-ordered settlement agreement. And there were three things in that court-ordered settlement agreement we had to address. Wilderness characteristics, off-highway vehicle determinations, and then what happens when grazing permits are relinquished. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on those. So with grazing permits, there's two things. One is what will happen with permits if they're voluntarily relinquished. So in other words, Ranger A comes in and says, I don't want my grazing permit anymore, we're giving it back to BLM. In the settlement agreement, we are required to look at a whole bunch of different alternatives in the RMP, and I'm going to kind of outline some of those alternatives. But one of those alternatives in the settlement agreement is looking at suspending that grazing permit for the duration of the plan. I'm not saying that's the direction BLM's going, I'm saying that's one of the things we have to consider. The other thing is what happens in areas with rangeland health violations. So let's kind of drill down into the RMP here. So I'm going to go through each of those three areas. So for wilderness characteristics, so the areas that are in pink up here are the areas where we found wilderness characteristics. There's 100 different units we're going to look at in the RMP. For each of those 100 units, under each alternative in the RMP, we have to figure out which of these three categories we're going to put it in for options for management. So even though we found wilderness characteristics, we can choose to put it in category 1, which is emphasize other multiple uses as a priority over wilderness characteristics. So what does that mean? It means we don't manage any of that wilderness characteristics unit. Essentially, wilderness characteristics will continue to be there until they're not. So what do I mean by that? You have a geographic area that has wilderness characteristics, we say we're not going to manage it. Over the next 20 years, nothing happens there that takes wilderness characteristics away. We don't do any new road building, we don't change anything. 20 years from now, wilderness characteristics may still be there, but under category 1, we've made a conscious decision we're not going to manage for wilderness characteristics. Okay. Category 2, we can emphasize other multiple uses while applying some management restrictions to reduce impacts to wilderness characteristics. So what kind of management restrictions would we do? This wouldn't necessarily be prohibiting something from happening. It would be incorporating maybe some mitigation measures to reduce the impacts of wilderness characteristics. Let's say let's say somebody wants to go in under category 2 and put in a new water pipeline, water tank for livestock. One of the things we might ask is, instead of getting a vertical water tank that's 50 feet high, exaggeration, maybe we get a tank that sits on its side or something so it's not as apparent. Maybe we ask you to change the location a little bit so it's a little more hidden. That could be what happens in category 2. Again, it's not going to prohibit anything from happening. It's just going to allow us to still try to maintain wilderness characteristics in those areas one way or another.
So it would still be possible through the middle of one of those areas to put in a water pipeline?
Correct.
But that would create a new boundary?
It would only create a new boundary if there were a right-of-way associated with it.
Okay.
Depending on the issue. So if it was a new road and a pipeline, and that road went all the way through and bisected the unit, then that would create a new boundary. So again, category 1 and 2, I'm not getting personal here. Category 1 and 2, I kind of made this up, the 3 categories so folks can look at it. Category 1 and 2 don't emphasize management for wilderness characteristics, only category 3 does. So category 1 and 2, category 2, just the way it's different from category 1, so I make sure everybody understands it. Category 2, we wouldn't emphasize wilderness characteristics, but we would still try to maintain it in the unit. Under category 1, those are areas where we expect it to go away over time. We've either chosen to not manage for it, or there are areas where we just know we're not going to be able to control it. Okay. Category 3 are areas where we emphasize wilderness character over other multiple uses. So this would be an area where we say things that are compatible with wilderness characteristics are going to continue to go on. Livestock grazing. Livestock grazing in and of itself is a compatible use with wilderness. So where you start getting into a gray area is all the infrastructure that goes along with that. So water holes, pipelines, water tanks, troughs, those kind of things can start taking away a little bit from wilderness characteristics, right?
So on the third one, what other uses by the public, not necessarily grazing,
sure,
would be restricted or prohibited under number 3?
So specifically for wilderness characteristics, think of an example. So say off-highway motorized vehicle use, so cross-country use by motorized vehicles. Recreating member of the public, there may be an open area out there right now that's open to cross-country travel. They can pretty much ride anywhere they want. This is just an example, I'm not necessarily saying we're going this direction, but under category 3, we might say that in those areas that have wilderness characteristics that are in category 3, the only routes that are now open to motorized use are those routes that are designated. They can't drive anywhere they want in the unit now. It's only they have to stay on the motorized routes. I'm trying to think of other examples. Something else, some other uses that might be prohibited under category 3. So if we chose to manage a unit for category 3, things like potentially solar, wind exploration, new wind towers, solar, potentially new right-of-ways, those kind of things might be prohibited under category 3.
Inclusive of communication towers and such.
Correct. Things that are going to detract from naturalness is what it boils down to. So those things that cause larger things that are going to be considered unnatural.
One of the questions I had is just about, like, say something like a juniper cut. Is that allowed if it was under emphasis number 3?
So, great question. The answer is it depends. Okay, so how would a juniper cut detract from naturalness? And this is another one of those areas that kind of gets kind of squishy and the devil's in the details, right? So the reason I say it depends is it depends on the kind of juniper cut. How far apart are the trees? How big are the trees? What are you going to do with the material when you're done?
Could you still use power tools or, saws or?
I haven't got that far down in the weeds yet. I don't
Yeah.
know. Yeah, it's a consideration. I mean, realistically, I don't see anything in category 3 being more restrictive than what we currently have for wilderness study areas. And so in wilderness study areas right now, we have the ability to use power tools if it's kind of that minimum tool in order to get the job done. So in other words, if we were to, we haven't done a lot of this here, but I know other districts have. They've done juniper cuts in WSA. And in order to do that, they analyzed it in a NEPA document. They decided the minimum tool they could use was a chainsaw. Because realistically, you got 1,000 acres to a juniper to cut in a WSA, it's going to take a long time if you're using a handsaw. So they analyzed the minimum tool and they were allowed to use chainsaws in WSA. I don't see category 3 being more restrictive than WSA.
Is it taking the place or is it working with NEPA?
I'm sorry.
NEPA. Is this process taking the place of this NEPA or is it working in conjunction with it?
So this category 1, 2, and 3 is working in conjunction.
Okay.
So the NEPA that we're going to be doing here is an environmental impact statement for a resource management plan.
Okay.
And 1, 2, and 3 are the categories for each alternative that we have to put these 100 units in. So my next slide will show some of that. Any other questions on this before I move to the next slide? Okay, so for wilderness characteristics in the RMP, every time we do NEPA of any kind, whether it's an EIS, whether it's an EA, we're required to look at several alternatives. If we don't look at a wide range of alternatives, then we get hung up on it because the courts will, if we get taken to court, the courts will say you didn't look at a wide enough range. So I want to make sure folks don't panic when they see some of these because we basically could select any alternative. So the alternatives I'm going to show you are only for example. We have not built any alternatives yet. These are only examples. There's a couple of these that we know we're going to have because we're required to, but we haven't built any alternatives. So don't start reading into this more than what's here. Okay, so when we consider a wide range of alternatives, we always have to consider the no action. That's status quo, exactly what we're doing now. This land use plan amendment is going to have a weird no action alternative, okay? Because the status quo, right now we're under a settlement agreement with the plaintiffs in that case. And that settlement agreement says any area where you found wilderness characteristics, you cannot do an activity in there that would preclude the area from having wilderness characteristics down the road. So our current no action alternative is what we're doing right now, including that settlement agreement. I know that's it's probably not as weird for you guys as it is for me, but I'm used to thinking of the no action alternative as what our existing 2003 RMP said. But that's not the true no action. Okay, so we got the no action alternative, continue doing what we're doing. So right now, out of these 100 units, we can't do anything in one of those 100 units. If we wanted to build a new road, if we wanted to put in a new pipeline, if we wanted to put in a new right-of-way, we can't do it until this RMP process is finished. So the no action is keep going down that road. Alternative A is our old 2003 RMP as it was written. So that's no management for wilderness characteristics. That puts all 100 units in category 1. Emphasize other multiple uses. Alternative B, so there are some things in the settlement agreement that we're also required to analyze, so we know there's going to be at least 2 settlement agreement alternatives. Both of those settlement agreement alternatives will consider full protections, category 3 for all 100 units of wilderness characteristics. And then BLM will likely create our own alternative, and our own alternative will probably be a split for these 100 units, split between Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3. Some units will go in Category 1, some will go in Category 2, some will go in Category 3. And then other alternatives. As you know, the federal agencies have resource advisory committees. Ours is the Southeast Oregon RAC Resource Advisory Committee. That Resource Advisory Committee is working on developing an alternative for BLM to consider. I don't know if they'll get there and be able to get that recommended or not, but they are working on one. Okay. So this is some potential alternatives just as it relates to wilderness characteristics. Yeah.
So if the county suggested alternative, you would recommend for it to be an alternative for each category, not just one alternative that would be, you can't recommend. It'd probably be best if we done an alternative for 3 different categories.
So are you asking if the county did an alternative,
submitted that,
should that alternative consider all 3 categories, Category 1, 2, and 3? That's up to you guys to decide. So let me kind of put a box around that a little bit. So let's say the county submits an alternative to BLM. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to see if that alternative is similar to any of the other alternatives. So if the county were to submit an alternative that said, you know what, we want to put all of these in Category 1, every one of them, all 100. We would look at that and we would say, well, that's virtually identical to Alternative A that we're already analyzing. So we probably wouldn't add a new alternative, we would probably just go ahead and analyze Alternative A. So if the county were to submit something that was somewhat different from all the other alternatives, then that would be a new alternative that we'd analyze in detail. You know, we would still take it into consideration, but when you analyze alternatives in detail, it's a lot of staff time to go through all the detail to fully analyze an alternative. So the county could submit one that was very similar to one of those. There's 2 things that could happen. It could cause us to maybe modify one of these existing alternatives, or we would lump it in with one of the existing alternatives, or we could analyze the county alternative completely. So one of those 3 things could happen.
And who makes that decision, if it's just molded in with one of your already alternatives, or if it's standalone?
It probably boils back to the decision makers to make that ultimate decision. So essentially on an RMP, there's 3 decision makers: the field manager, the district manager, and the state director. Those are the 3 people that sign the RMP. It would probably be a group decision. Yeah. Okay, so the same alternatives, A, B, C, D, and no action, we're going to now carry over into the other issues we have to deal with through the settlement agreement. So off-highway vehicle designations. Again, we're required to analyze a wide range of alternatives. So some of these alternatives, we would potentially continue with our existing management and stay exactly the same. Other under alternatives, some of those areas potentially could be closed to all motorized vehicles. So what does that mean, closed? So if you take, let's use one of these bigger units as an example. This one here, there's routes going through here. They're unconstructed routes, right? We looked at some of those that are not constructed. They don't meet the boundary definition. If we closed this unit to motorized vehicles, that means all those routes that are inside there would become closed. It would only be the boundary roads you'd be able to travel on. So those could become closed to motorized use. They could all stay completely open to motorized use, and an open designation means you can drive anywhere you want inside that unit, whether it's on a road or not, anywhere, cross country. And then there's the third designation that's limited. And limited means it's either limited to the existing motorized routes that are there or to designated routes. So under a limited category, you can only drive on the motorized routes. You can't drive cross country. In that example, all those individual routes that are within one of these units would still be open, but you couldn't drive cross-country from one route to the next.
Can you explain what the difference is between existing routes and designated routes?
I knew you were going to ask me that. All right, so existing routes, it's a snapshot in time. When we initiate the RMP, we'll take that road inventory. So that route inventory that all you guys did several years ago with the county, we took the information that you guys provided on new routes, we incorporated it into our database, which is GIS. So they're recorded in GIS, all those routes that were identified, we verified that they existed, put them into GIS. So existing, limited to existing routes means a snapshot in time. So when we start the RMP process, we'll take that GIS layer that has all those existing routes, and all of those that are existing would be open. So limited to designated routes means we would take that same boundary, we would take all the existing routes, and we may say, well, for resource purposes, we want to close this one and this one, but the rest remain open. Or we could say, here are all the ones snapshot in time, we're limiting to designated routes, or we're not closing anything. So we get a lot of pressure nationally to go to designated routes, because designated routes, a lot of times we're doing that snapshot in time with the RMP, but those all become designated routes. And so that way, if somebody adds a road 3 years down the way, it's not a new road that people think they can travel on. That's the problem with having it limited to existing routes, is it's really hard to tell what existed at that snapshot in time. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, so wide range of alternatives for off-highway vehicles. So grazing, there's two different things. Remember, we're going to talk about rangeland health first. So as part of the settlement agreement, we are required under at least one alternative to consider in places where we have a rangeland health violation. In other words, we did a rangeland health evaluation, and due to livestock, there's a portion of the area that is not meeting rangeland health standards. Okay. Under one of these alternatives, we're required to consider closing that portion of that pasture, or that portion of that allotment, for the duration of the plan. That's one alternative. Some of the other alternatives, we would continue doing management the way we are right now. So the way we are right now, when we get a rangeland health violation, it's on a case-by-case basis. We look at the violation, is it due to livestock? If it is due to livestock, we're required by regulation to make changes before the next growing season. Those changes could be anything. It could be changes in the duration, intensity, timing of grazing. It could be that we fence out a portion of that. Those are all done on a case-by-case basis now. So under some of those alternatives, we would have a continuation of existing management, which is case-by-case.
So on rangeland health, is weeds considered part of the rangeland health?
So for rangeland health, there are 5, there's a whole little booklet on what Oregon, Washington does for rangeland health. There's 5 areas that are considered. It includes everything from watershed function. Weeds is a tiny part, I guess is what I'm saying. There's 5 different factors. It's watershed function, ecological function, threatened endangered species, and man, I'm drawing a blank.
The vegetative part of the function. The
Riparian is one, and then there's a 5th. So we look at those 5 factors. We determine if they're functional. If something's non-functional, then we go on to determine if livestock is a causal factor in that. So for example, some of the ones that I've worked on in the past, we had some non-functioning portions because of juniper. livestock was not necessarily a causal factor in that, and so the only places we're looking at regarding rangeland health here is where livestock is a causal factor.
Hey, Todd.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. Do you consider horses livestock?
You had to ask me about livestock. I consider horses livestock if they're permitted on the permit. If they're wild horses,
No such thing.
if they're horses covered under the Wild Horse and Burro Act, they are considered, but they are not considered livestock in this sense. So in other words, for a rangeland health violation, if we had an area, let's just say Beatty's Butte, as an example, let's say we had a geographic area and an allotment that had wild horses and it had livestock. If we were seeing ecological function as part of the rangeland health, if we're seeing a violation there for rangeland health for ecological function, we would have to try to tease out, is that livestock or is that wild horses? It's still not meeting rangeland health, but is livestock a causal factor or wild horses a causal factor? So it's separated out from that extent. So I guess the point I was trying to make is if you have a rangeland health violation and you've got wild horses that are causing the problem, livestock shouldn't get dinged for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So voluntary permit relinquishment. Okay, so somebody comes in and says we want to voluntarily give up our permit. Under these alternatives, it'll be a range from continuation of what we're doing now, which is everything's considered on a case-by-case basis, over to something that's more restrictive where we would suspend the portion of the permit that is within a special management area. And so this goes even a little farther than wilderness characteristics. So in the settlement agreement, it says anything that is WSA, ACEC, RNA, wilderness characteristics, or critical endangered species habitat, any of those categories, if somebody came in and voluntarily relinquished a permit, under that alternative, we would suspend the portion of that permit that is within that special management area. So one extreme down to continue doing what we're doing now. Those will be the range of alternatives we'll have to consider there. Jesse?
I have a question on that, and I'm sure there's been quite a bit of scrutiny on it, but is that consistent with the Taylor Grazing Act?
Great question. I'll give you your $5 for asking that question later. Maybe, maybe not. And we've been told by our solicitors that in order to consider alternatives, just to consider the alternative, they don't have to be legal. We can consider alternatives that technically by the rule of the law are not legal, just in order, because remember, what we're doing here is we're considering a wide range of alternatives in order to look at those environmental effects. And that question's been debated back and forth, because we as managers, a lot of times we go, well, that's not even legal, why would we consider it? But the direction we get from our attorneys is it doesn't have to be legal to consider it. It may have to be legal if you select it as an alternative when you make your decision, but it doesn't have to be legal to be considered. Okay. So how can the public participate in the RMP process? The public can work with their cooperating agencies. So again, cooperating agencies are other government and tribal agencies that have a seat at the table during the process. Each of these agencies is limited on their input in the planning process related to whatever their expertise is for their particular agency. So right now, again, we have 2, Lake County and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I was approached during the break by the SWCDs, and so we'll get MOUs started for those folks. Another way the public at large can participate is through the public comment period. So when we do an environmental impact statement for an RMP, we'll write that EIS and we'll have a draft. That draft will go out to the public for 60 to 90 days, depending on the type of RMP it is. For an amendment, it's 60 days. For a full-blown RMP, it's 90 days. So the public will get 2 full months to look at that draft, to provide public feedback to the BLM on that draft. We'll take that public feedback, we lump like concerns into issues, and then we kind of look through those issues. And then, based on that feedback, we develop a final RMP. That final RMP goes out, and then based on that, we'll make a decision on one of the alternatives, and then we'll publish the record of decision when we're done. So this whole process, we expect the public comment period to come sometime in the spring of 2019. We're looking probably around March sometime, if we're able to keep up with our current schedule. One of the things that I'm trying to set up, I know one of the struggles with the public in general is folks really have a hard time understanding how to write comments that are helpful to the agency, right? Because a lot of times we get comments that's a form letter that says, I don't like alternative A, I think you should select alternative C, or I think you should manage everything for wilderness characteristics, or I think you should manage nothing for wilderness characteristics. You know, those are great opinions, but they don't have a lot of substance that tells us what needs to be changed in the draft document. And so I'm going to try to get somebody to come in and teach a workshop on how to do substantive comments. So we may get a lot of attendance, we may not, but I'm going to kind of take a gamble and try to get that set up so that not only for this process, but for other processes down the road, folks have an opportunity to kind of learn what kind of comments are going to help BLM formulate a good, solid document.
I have a question. With your inventory and the map and everything, does that make all these a special management area? And if so, would ones in category 1 be taken out of that?
So these will not become a land management designation like WSA, like ACEC,
RNA.
just because we're precluded by Congress right now from doing that for wilderness characteristics. What they will have is within those polygons, there could be management restrictions placed on those, but not a designation. So they don't get a new name, but there could be management restrictions. Off-highway vehicles, for example, where we could say this area is open to cross-country travel now, and we're going to make it limited. So there's going to be a series of those kind of things that we have to go through for the RMP for each of those individual units.
It won't be designated, but in effect, it would be institutionalized to the next level.
To some degree. To some degree.
Todd, I got a question.
Yeah.
So, as a cooperating agency, the county, us being, our expertise is the demographics and the socioeconomics. Let's just say the county hires a rangeland specialist. Would that give the county more teeth or more say in what goes on? Because they're specializing not only in the socioeconomics, but also in the rangeland or biology or whatever we need. Would that give the county more teeth in gathering information that would be useful to people?
So you're talking about during the RMP process or after the RMP process?
Or maybe both, just, yeah, where it's just giving you an example, we hired somebody as a rangeland expert with a biology and fish and wildlife biology degree or whatever.
Right.
Would that give the county more teeth in creating these?
So during the RMP process, if the county was to create an alternative, and the county wanted to hire a consultant to advise them on creating that alternative, that's totally with the county.
But would it give
The one thing the county can't do as a cooperating agency is the county can't hire a consultant to represent them at the IDT meetings. That consultant would be entirely advisory to the county, so it's got to be a county employee that represents the county at the IDT meeting.
Okay, so like, great, what you have up there, our expertise is, does that limit us as far as?
Yes. Okay. So it does. Your expertise that you bring to the table limits, so the counties, I can't think of great examples necessarily for the county, but let's say Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm going to pick on John because he's sitting in the back. So John comes in and says, you know, my expertise is fish and wildlife, but I'm going to give you comments on, I don't know.
Socioeconomics.
What?
Socioeconomics.
So socioeconomics, or which you probably have some socioeconomics for hunting.
Yeah,
You could give us expertise on. But let's say he's going to comment on recreation. His expertise is fish and wildlife, but he's trying to guide some of the recreation stuff. That starts getting fuzzy. And so the county is a little bit harder though, you know, because you guys, you know, you have a recreation plan, county recreation plan. You're tied in with tourism, so you have a part, even though I only listed socioeconomics and some of that, it's a little fuzzier for the county because you have some other areas. I'd have to think about the range example you used a little bit. I don't know whether that one would qualify or not.
Well, I think one place we qualify that hasn't been talked about is the casual observer. And there's a lot of weight put in on this as a casual observer. It's not listed up there. But when we're talking solitude and we're talking casual observer, that fits us.
Todd, I think the example would be that a cooperating agency is allowed to provide a draft analysis of alternatives, like what the Harney County SWCD did and the draft and the EIS, at which point, because of your cooperating agency, the BLM is required to provide analysis of that, which is the lawsuit taking place in Harney County right now.
Right.
So you can provide an analysis, a full analysis that has to be, or a full alternative, excuse me, that has to be analyzed by the BLM.
But would it hold more weight if we had like a specialist?
Not necessarily, because we're not going to analyze, we're not going to look at it and say who did the analysis. We're going to look at it as how does that analysis compare with what the BLM expertise thinks? Did you guys analyze something that we missed? Are you analyzing an alternative that's different? Or did you bring forward an alternative that's different from some of the others? And the degree of difference, that's kind of subject to debate, and like with the sage grouse plan and the Harney County lawsuit, Harney County brought forward an alternative, and the BLM did not analyze, they chose not to analyze that alternative in full. I'm not familiar enough with the case to know what the reason was, but like I mentioned earlier, if the county brings forward an alternative, the first thing we're going to do is compare it to the others. Is it close to any of these? If it's really close, we're going to lump it in. If it's very different and unique, we'll analyze it in full. So, but to answer your question, to me, I don't think it's going to matter whether you hire a range expert or not. I'm just going to look at the alternative you present and look at its merits.
Is there any chance that Lake County could partner with the Soil and Water, as basically two cooperating agencies, and use their expertise in the socioeconomic and the soil water district, use its expertise in rangeland, watersheds, on and on. I didn't know if you could,
To
I mean, that might be a
formulate
logistical nightmare.
To formulate an alternative?
Yeah, that
So-
would cover,
So
be more broad-based.
anybody can bring forward an alternative at any time.
Okay.
You as a private citizen could bring forward an alternative. It's harder for you as a private citizen to bring forward an alternative when you don't know what's already being considered, and you don't get to see it as a private, you don't get to see everything as a private citizen until the draft comes out. Whereas cooperating agencies will be at the table all along. And so not that one alternative packs more weight than the other, it's easier for BLM if there are outside alternatives coming in to see those alternatives from a cooperating agency early in the process than to go back and analyze them after the draft is already out. And I don't remember in Harney County's case, they didn't.
The answer to that, Jesse, is in Harney County, the SWCD and the Harney County Court work together.
Did they, that's what I was wondering, I wasn't sure if they did or not.
Yeah.
Or could or not,
Yeah,
you know,
you
by the
can.
way that.
So back to Mark's suggestion, I'm not thinking so much as a range con consultant to this, because BLM management has range cons with on-the-ground experience. They have wildlife biologists on-the-ground experience. What federal agencies don't have, to any great extent, is expertise, a person who specializes in, I won't use the word socioeconomic, because it's actually social and economic, although there's overlap. That's what the federal agencies are less
Very much so.
Equipped to address, and a consultant to the county to help us focus on the social and the economic would be money better spent. You can always get the economics kind of out there somewhat, but social, like the values that all of you guys grew up with and what you share, cannot be extrapolated and put into the document unless somebody compels it.
Yeah.
So the social / economic is where it will help.
So a lot of times what happens on these big projects, because I don't have local staff to do that work, a lot of times it's farmed out to a contractor, or it's farmed out to somebody in our Portland office to kind of crunch the numbers, what kind of an economic impact is this gonna have?
So in Crook County, the Crook County Court has a natural resource plan they put together that's about 40 pages long that addresses all socioeconomics within the county, and they submit that at every NEPA process taking place in any federal agency. I think it's something that Lake County should be looking at as your way to provide that information at the very get-go.
And it's really important if the agency is sued because they chose to go one direction and it goes to the Ninth Circuit down in Frisco, kind of liberal, and they look at what are the factors that you consider. The environmentalist is going to focus on wilderness characteristics. And if we don't have any of our own social in there to counter it, the judgment would go with the environmental. So that's why the social / economic, to me, is greatly more important.
So I'm going to take it plumb sideways because we went past something I need to know. I personally completely disagree with the inventory and inventory process. We're talking about accepting the inventory process and putting alternatives onto these, basically 1 million acres out there. I personally disagree with that. What's the county's opportunity as cooperating agencies to file or come forward and say, we disagree, we don't believe the process was correct, because I honestly don't like the roads being a boundary. It quasi-creating wilderness study areas in my view, I'm talking only my view, and it's taken in thousands and thousands of acres that I don't believe meet wilderness characteristics. So we sort of jumped all the way to we're accepting them, and now you can comment on the alternative. For me, I need to know what is the opportunity to question or to say, we're not accepting this inventory as presented because it's completely different than what I personally view.
Yeah, great question. So I don't have any control over that. So essentially that inventory BLM inventories are a finding because they are flexible and they can change. They're not a public process other than citizen inventories or pointing out mistakes that were made during the inventory process. So outside of pointing out mistakes, outside of the stuff I covered today, pointing out mistakes, submitting a citizen inventory, probably the only other thing that could be done. The county can come to me and I can forward that up the chain. There's no official appeal process like there is with NEPA documents. There's always litigation. There's always appealing to someone higher up the chain than me. Other than that, I don't know that I can offer any other remedies.
Okay, so I don't know that I'm reading this correctly or whatever. I believe we have an opportunity, if you have the budget, to ask for a different analysis. Is that, I'm trying to read through being a cooperating agency, and I haven't asked that from my legal side.
Yeah.
But I believe there, unless I'm reading it wrong, there's an opportunity for us to request that. If you have the budget and agree to that, then you could redo an analysis of the inventory.
So does that, you're looking at the cooperating agency manual, does that specifically talk about inventories or does that talk about analysis under the RMP?
Well,
analysis of effects.
I need somebody legal to read it.
Well, and I probably do too on my side, because I don't know if I can make that.
Yeah, yeah.
I would suspect.
So I guess my question would be, do you have any budget if we requested a different analysis?
I'd have to take a look at that. This took us, here's my issue, okay? So it took us 3 years to do this re-inventory. Probably cost us in the neighborhood of, I'm gonna guess $250,000 to do the re-inventory over that 3-year period. I probably don't have the money to redo that without getting special money to do it. The other issue that I have is I've been given my marching orders by the Deputy Secretary of the Interior to complete the RMP by October of 2019. So for me, it puts me in an awkward position where if I go back and redo the inventory, we're talking 3 years, I've got to go back to the Deputy Secretary and say, okay, the RMP is not going to get done in 2019. That's better coming from somebody else other than me. You know, and I guess as far as what you're reading in the cooperating agency handbook, I think the analysis they're talking about is probably the effects analysis when you get to the RMP and the EIS. It's probably not talking about an inventory, but if your legal counsel tells you differently, then come talk to me and we'll put our legal counsels together and we can sort it out.
Yeah. So getting back to my other question on the inventory and not agreeing with inventory, there's no appeal process. Technically, the only option we really have would be litigation. And you can't advise me on that, but I'm just reiterating.
Probably I see two potential options, probably litigation or appealing to a higher power within BLM or within the Department of Interior.
Okay.
You know, if the Deputy Secretary came to me and said, I want you to redo the inventory, I'm going to redo the inventory.
All right.
The part that I would ask of the Deputy Secretary, all the inventory so far has been done by my staff in-house. And my staff feels like a ping pong ball going back and forth between two paddles.
Mm-hmm.
And so the one request I would make if that were to come down is that they do an independent inventory and my staff doesn't do it.
Well, that could be a request from somebody that goes higher above you and request a third party or something like that.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Hey Todd, so was it your staff that did the inventory before in 2010, 2008?
Yes.
Yes. Why was the acre so much different then than it is now?
The main difference is the things that we did wrong in the initial inventory. I don't know if there's still those checklists over there or not.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, this right here kind of outlines kind of how our marching orders changed, and it identifies the areas that we were doing incorrectly the first time.
If we are to do a citizens inventory, how long do we have to submit that back to you?
I'm embarrassed to tell you. A citizen inventory can be submitted at any time. Because of the timeframes I was given by the Deputy Secretary to complete the RMP, I need them like probably within the next month.
It took you 3 years and you're giving us 30 days from today.
It took me 3 years to do 2.7 million acres. I know it sucks. Those are the timeframes I'm been given.
Yeah, does that have to be on a per unit basis or a resource area basis?
3 years.
No. For the, if they have 30 days, is that per unit or per the whole resource area?
In order for me, so let me back up and explain it this way. So I have to have a draft RMP basically done by the first part of January. So in order to incorporate a new inventory, so the first thing I'm going to look at, you submit a new citizens inventory. I'm going to look at it, I'm going to compare it to our existing inventory, and I'm going to say, did we miss something? Do we just disagree on what's the casual observer, or did we actually miss something? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at that. If it's really just a disagreement, if there isn't anything we missed, then I'm probably going to continue with our inventory. If there is something we missed, we'll modify our inventory and redo that. But in order for me to incorporate that into the RMP, I'm going to need to have it, because basically my staff, I have to incorporate it into an alternative. Then the staff has to analyze what the effects are of that alternative on all of their different resources, and before I can finish the draft. And I have to have a draft done by the beginning of January. So my time's pretty limited.
So I guess the question still though that I'm coming back to is it
the whole area?
Is it the whole area, or can someone provide it by just one of those
Oh, you can
units?
provide it any way you want. It
So it can just be one unit.
Absolutely. Yeah, you do not, citizen inventory does not, thanks for clarifying that, I missed that. Does not have to be the whole thing. And, you know, if there's 100 units here, if there's 100 people and they all do one unit, that's every one of them. But again, I'm gonna look at the merits of that citizen inventory and see if there's something we failed to address. And if there's something that we failed to address, I don't necessarily expect you to go do a whole citizen inventory. If you're a permittee and you come to me and you say, hey, there's a 30,000 gallon bright orange water tank in the middle of this unit that you guys didn't talk about in the inventory, I'm going to investigate that and see if there's something we missed.
So, I think I picked up along the way, if you go to the narrative of the unit in question, and if there are things in that unit that aren't talked about in the narrative, that's the best way to get at the question, did we miss something?
Correct. Aren't talked about on the narrative or aren't addressed on the map. So the narrative is going to say something, it's going to be hard just to pick it out from the narrative. The narrative may say there's, 15.8 miles of 3-strand barbed wire fence in the unit. If it fails to mention a water tank that's there, that's something that we probably missed. Yep. And so on that website, each of those 100 units has its own independent evaluation that has a narrative and maps, goes by the unit name, and then there's one of these big maps. So if you're trying to figure out what the names are, where they're at, if you have a specific allotment or a specific area you're interested in, and you want to know what the evaluation names are, so you don't have to go through open every 100 of them, you can look at this big map. They're all in Adobe, so you can zoom in. This map is created big, so you can zoom way in and look at it. There's not a tremendous amount of detail on this map, but at least it'll point you in the right direction.
I got a question for Brad. So are you more concerned with the actual inventory or how the inventory is taken?
I would say both. Absolutely both. When some of the inventory was done, I would say that some of the, in my opinion, some of the stuff that was brought forward was basically brought forward by an individual, and his or her expertise of, well, to me, this has wilderness characteristics and this is solitude. And me, myself, I completely disagree with some of those thoughts. Whenever there's a road there, and yeah, there's a beautiful rim, but there's a road there, that's not solitude to me. But they keep that inclusive in there, and so that one person brought that forward. I don't believe that, that it represents what a lot of people's thoughts of solitude is. As far as the inventory, I fully disagree with this cherry stemming, because of you can have 70,000 acre wilderness characteristics, and right in the middle of it, they cherry stem this out and say, oh, well, this isn't going to have wilderness characteristics. We're going to take it out. Everything else does. It's not even considered now because of the cherry stemmed out. To the average Joe, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense to me either. So, you know, you take that out, and all of a sudden, and then you talk the boundaries. There's a boundary line. Take a look up there. There's a boundary line. That's all that is a boundary line. On both sides is now wilderness characteristics, but it's called two different units because there's a boundary line.
Well, it's more than boundary line. So there's a boundary line that sits, let's say it's a road that forms the boundary. I guarantee you that it's semantics. I agree with you, but if that road, the boundary isn't in the middle of the road, the boundary is on the edges of the disturbance. So there is still a gap. Granted, it's probably only 20 feet wide, but there is a gap between boundaries.
The definition is road using as a boundary is what the right-of-way is.
Right-of-way or the edges of the disturbance.
Yeah. So I have a concern with that, Mark, and I have a concern. We all know that there's lands out there that have wilderness characteristics. I believe this is making them much bigger than what they are. If we have something out there, and we all know there's actually wilderness characteristics, let's make the boundary accurate and correct. Let's not include all the way out here to this road that takes in an extra 10,000 acres. That's where I believe that it was done wrong, is if we truly have these resources out here that's so beautiful and pristine, let's narrow it down to what they are, not what somebody, casual observer, thinks they are. And that doesn't mean that fits your criteria. No. That's my personal opinion and some of the angst I have about it.
One of the things that bothers me, I realize that you have to follow the rules that are handed down. But from 2003 to now, the rules have changed. And they've changed your rules, which is bullshit.
Not only did they change the rule, well, they had to go back through this, but then what they made as the criteria changed.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Whenever they was doing the inventory, and I think it was the state director or manager probably made those rules. I don't know who did, but that's
who did make those rules, Tom?
So the checklist, so the manual is a BLM manual, that's national guidance. The checklist resulted from our state director requested an independent review. Here's kind of how this came down. So the Vail district had considerably different findings than Lakeview. Some of the plaintiffs in the original settlement agreement went to the state director, said you've got two different offices doing this two different ways. The results are very different. So he's going, well, it's two different land bases. I don't know whether it's realistic or not. And so he asked for an independent review. So they had two BLM National Wilderness people come out, do that independent review. Based on their review, one of our state office wilderness specialists developed that checklist of those items that we had to go back and reconsider. And that was given to us as guidance for both efforts, both Lakeview and Vail. Here's this checklist. Go back, look at the checklist, look at your original unit evaluations. For Lakeview, that basically caused an entire reevaluation. You know, out of those 100 units, probably 70 or 80 of them changed. there's probably only about 20% that didn't change from the original.
So only 20 of them, under the regular rules, the original rules, would be under that now. If we're going by.
Well, not necessarily. I say they changed in one form or another. Even though they changed, they may not necessarily have still had wilderness characteristics even the second go around. But yeah, pretty high number.
I mean, we would be pretty close to saying that there would only be around 20 of them instead of 100.
Yeah, it'd be pretty close. And so the one caveat I would say, and it's kind of minute, but essentially it's not necessarily that the rule changed, it's that the way we were interpreting the rule the first time may have been incorrect. So so all we had the first go
who said
around,
that?
all we had the first go around was the manual, the 6310 manual. And there's a lot of places in there where you can kind of interpret things one way or another. Some of the stuff we were doing was fairly clear in the manual and we didn't do it right. Other things were kind of obtuse in the manual and they gave us more clarification in the checklist. So I would caution on saying that the manual changed or that the rule set changed. It's really an interpretation of what the rules mean that changed.
Would it be fair to say a lot of that's from the solicitors, from the lawsuit, from your lawyers? On risk aversion?
No, I don't think that's accurate.
It was
I don't think it's.
the independent review, and then the field office person in Portland, they're the one that
That's where the checklist
reinterpreted.
came from. Yeah, I wouldn't say it was from the solicitors.
I'm just curious, did they ever discuss, like, maybe Vail got it wrong and Lakeview had it right?
So
or is that-
Vail had to go back and redo their analysis the same as we did.
Oh, they did? Okay.
And what were their results?
So their original
That's
results
curious.
were about 1.2 million acres of wilderness character in their original results. And their review took them about 3 weeks. Ours took us 3 years.
And we went from how many acres to how many?
Man, you remember what, you weren't even here. I can't ask you. We went from, I'm guessing about, well, we weren't finished with the full inventory. And some of the more difficult units we'd saved to the very end because we couldn't agree. So I'm guessing it probably would have been about maybe 300,000 acres in the original inventory. That's a guess, to 1.6 million in this inventory.
So, and what's the total number of acres managed in
WSA?
No, in this district.
Oh, 3.2 million acres. So if you add up the 100 wilderness characteristics units, if you add up 100 wilderness characteristics units and you include WSA, that's not including any ACDC, RNAs, anything else. My math, I think it comes to about 63% of this field office. So it's over half.
So how did Vail's review only take 3 weeks then? How did that?
I don't work in Vail, I don't know.
And theirs didn't change their area?
Not significantly.
After listening to most of this, I can see the part that there's probably some places out there where there were things missed, and that might be the low-hanging fruit, but it appears to me there's, the language that I read in the manual is substantially unnoticeable. And if, say you've got a pasture of water holes that are maintained, and you've got berms and they're mineral soil and you can see them from 2 miles away. If we bring in photographic evidence that this is what these 4 photographs represent 70% of the unit, in all of these photographs you can see these berms are clearly not natural, they're clearly 2 miles away. Is there, at some point this not noticeable got to pass the smell test, and some of us think it doesn't. And you make the point that if something was missed, it's up for discussion, but if we don't agree with the decision, that's just flat up, not up for discussion?
I wouldn't say it's not flat up, not for discussion, but I would take your comment one step further. Not only are they substantially noticeable, but the casual observer is going to substantially notice them. Or are they substantially noticeable to the casual observer? And John, I get it. The one thing I can't do is I can't deal with 100 people coming in with a million things going back through that inventory, because I still have a limited amount of staff time and deadlines of deputy secretaries telling me I got to meet on the R&P. So I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place time-wise as well. So
you're not going to check these comments out, are you? I mean, are you not going to look at them?
I will take a look at them.
Yeah.
Well, the comments only deal with the alternatives pretty much, don't they?
Yeah, comments are going to be further down in the process. But for what John's talking about, coming in on an inventory and saying, I got these 20 things, we'll take a look at them, but I'm not going to agonize over them, I guess is what I'm saying.
So really, the only remedy is a lawsuit, essentially. But, I mean, that's how it got to this point in the first place, isn't it? So that's really the only remedy this community has, I guess.
Either that or me getting direction from somebody further up the chain.
There might be an opportunity for the permittees to prepare a package of information that they could take somewhere and say, this information needs some work before this RNP draft is launched. Maybe, I mean, I think the permittees got to get their heads together and talk about our opportunities, and it's probably a conversation to have in the room with permittees. I mean, any questions about this stuff need to be asked now, so when the permittees have their conversation, we know what we need to know, but I think the permittees got to go somewhere, and I mean, I kind of know how strong of an argument I can make about my allotment, and if you guys feel the same, if we can put together a packet that could go somewhere and influence somebody. I mean, that's the next step. Then, I mean, the step's very rigidly documented once you go into a draft EIS, what everybody's role is, but if there's a discussion to be had about the inventory, that's a looser discussion that'll probably happen with less defined rules, but we need to, you guys need to be comfortable with what you got and what you feel you can make the case doesn't fall under the category of substantially unnoticeable. You know, you got 10 days to document it, put a packet together. I mean, we got to go have it. We got a room here after this for the permittees to go into and have a meeting and ask your questions now, and then let's go have that meeting.
Can a cooperating agency form an alternative as well as ask for, or also propose an alternative inventory analysis that could then be submitted to a lawmaker?
So anybody can, so I guess I'm not sure what you mean about a lawmaker, but.
Well, we're talking about someone with influence to go to the undersecretary.
So basically, anybody can do a citizen's inventory. So citizen's inventory or mistakes could be pointed out by an individual permittee, by a landowner, by a private citizen that doesn't own land. It could be anybody. You know, that's above my level, really, the question you're asking. You need to ask John about that. Gina?
Todd, I was just curious if you could point out if a person was wanting to submit a citizen's inventory, what kind of things would they need to submit? And or if they have a development out there that was missed, what kind of documentation would they need to provide?
So if there's something that we missed, I would think just a map with a description of what it was we missed on it, I would think would be helpful. If you actually want to submit a citizen's inventory, list here. Basically, the minimum standard for review of new information when we submit a citizens inventory is a map of sufficient detail to determine specific boundaries of the area in question, a detailed narrative that describes the wilderness characteristics of the area or lack thereof, photographic documentation. So those are the three things that the citizens inventory will need to meet.
Have you received a citizen inventory from Honda? Yep.
So in 2005, we received, I think we've received at least 3, maybe 4 separate inventory documents from Honda. The bulk of that was received in 2005. And then we've received a few since then. And we've received, I believe, 1 from 1 individual private citizen other than Honda. There's 1 inventory, I believe.
Well, going with that is, was any of their inventory valid use for you?
So,
Or
that's,
how
yeah, it's a good question. So, when we receive a citizen's inventory and we go through our inventory document, we're required to summarize what's in that citizen's inventory. So when you read through these documents, you're going to get the impression, well, they just went with what Honda said. We summarize what was in Honda's, then we go through and we do our own evaluation. In some of those cases, we disagreed with individual portions. In some of those cases, we may have disagreed with the whole thing. There are areas we did not find wilderness characteristics where Honda did. There are areas where we found wilderness characteristics where Honda did not submit an inventory. So it kind of goes both ways. One of the major things I would say that's different between our 2 inventories is we disagree considerably with some of those citizen inventories on what meets the definition of a road and what doesn't. It's probably one of the bigger areas where there's disagreement.
If I understood, all private lands are exempt from any coverage.
Correct.
Do what you want with it.
Yeah. The ways that private land could potentially be affected, if you have a private inholding that's completely surrounded by BLM, during this RMP process, you should be paying attention, because if we were to place some kind of a restriction on that land surrounding your private land, that could affect you down the road if you're landlocked inside of BLM. So you definitely need to be paying attention to the RMP process. So one example of that is, let's say you own a piece of private land, BLM's found wilderness characteristics on the outside, and BLM decides to manage it as a Category 3 and elevate wilderness protections. And one of the things we do in that is we say we're not going to issue any new right-of-ways, and you decide you want to develop solar or wind power on your private land, you've got to figure out a way to get that power out. Well, if you're completely landlocked inside of BLM, there's no way to get a transmission line across BLM. That limits what you can do on that private land. So even though private lands are excluded, there still potentially could be impacts depending on how we manage those areas.
But if there's a road accessing that private land right now, mechanically, you're good.
The road would still form a Barrett boundary or a cherry stem, correct?
Some of our allotments, there's all those white PVC pipes with people that have mineral rights. Yeah. Are those still considered wilderness characteristic if it has all those?
It depends on whether those were substantially noticeable or not. And so if it's, that may be something that we missed. Bring it up. Look to see if the area you're thinking about is inside of one of the units, and then bring that up. And we'll take a look.
On these, if someone was to relinquish their permit and you have things that you could do, why wouldn't you consider a grass bank?
I think that's one of the things BLM will consider.
Yeah. It seems like that would be the first priority. Yeah.
And that may be a difference between some of those alternatives. Under one alternative, maybe we consider putting those into a grass bank. Under another alternative, that permit doesn't see any grazing. So we'll consider that in the alternatives. Grass banks are something we're very interested in. One of the things you got to realize is, how many of you want to voluntarily relinquish your permits? Raise of hands. Anybody? How many of you would sell if somebody bought you out? Okay. I don't see a lot of hands up in the air to start with, but if somebody were to sell, then that's a permit that BLM would consider. And likely that's what's going to happen, right?
We've got
Somebody's going to sell
$21
a
million
permit.
sitting there looking to do that.
Likely that's the way it would come about. Voluntary relinquishment is somebody's going to get bought out.
But I think that's something that really should be addressed, because look at all the fires. And people can't just go in and out of the cow business.
Yeah.
You know, they have to have a place to go.
Yeah. And grass banks are definitely in our list of things to consider in the alternatives.
I knew I'd take it sideways.
Oh, that's right. Good question. Yep. I'm relinquishing power. Is there anybody that didn't get documents that wants some of those documents?
Well, do you have the 2010B or the 6310? I see a 6320 here.
There's a 6310 and a 6320. And so if there's a document you want, come see me, give me your email address, and I'll make sure to mail you a link.
And where do we go,
I would go back to the social and economic.
like if they missed anything, like if they missed a.
Make comments
If they missed.
in addition to whether you think it's working or not. Social economic is one of those boring things that nobody really likes to endeavor. But there's a counterweight in a document that goes forward. It's just 2 cents. We need to address enhancing our social and economic section in the document. That has been a swivel point on some lawsuits.
So that concludes your presentation. Before we adjourn, is there any other questions of Todd? So with that, Todd and others, thank you very much for using this setting. Bill, trying to get the public here. Go ahead.
Could the Lake County stock growers be considered in with the
Cooperating agency?
Yeah.
So cooperating agencies can only be other government entities. So governments or tribal governments. Okay. So that also precludes other environmental groups like ONDA or somebody else from becoming cooperating agencies as well.
But that doesn't mean you can't advise us and give us support.
Okay.
Once again, thank you, Todd.
Is that my
role now? That is your role now. Just a little overview of that. Back in 2011-12, I done community meetings in conjunction with the BLM. The landowners, committees, hunters, and everybody marked up the maps. The Board of Commissioners, that they weren't public meetings as far as Board of Commissioners. It brought into a Board of Commissioners meeting as official record. The other 2 commissioners, myself, accept them as official record. But the required are the request to BLM to take it into theirs, and they have inventoried those. And that is your copy to keep there. We keep the copy originally. We finally found a place here local that can make the copies. So, thank you. And that is your set. Perfect. Okay.
If you don't want to come see me now, I'm gonna leave my cards over here. You can email me if you think about a request later. Sorry, I didn't bring a whole stack, so we'll have to fight over them.
The permittees could stay, the
We will adjourn
commissioners
the
are
county
giving us
meeting
this
at
room, so,
3:47.
permittees can get our heads together here for a bit. Strategize.
Perfect. I know you worked with Kate on the beginning of the contract, trying to figure out where it was going and whatnot, so I appreciate it. On this, yeah, okay. Yeah, no, it's good, it's good. So,
Yeah, that's what it means. That's what I
it is.